The most powerful man in the world spent his last morning signing marriage documents for his daughter. His hands, swollen beyond recognition from gout, could barely grip the quill. But here's the detail that haunts historians. Philip II of Spain had positioned his deathbed years earlier, deliberately placing it so he could stare directly at the altar of his palace chapel. For 8 weeks in 1598, as his body literally rotted away, he would lie in that exact spot, watching priests celebrate Mass through an open doorway while pus drained from his infected knee 40 times a day. This wasn't some tragic accident of fate. Philip had actually designed his entire palace monastery with his death in mind, creating what one observer would later call the most elaborate death chamber ever constructed by a living monarch. Picture Europe in the summer of 1598. Philip II controls an empire where the sun never sets. Spain, Portugal, half of Italy, the Netherlands, vast swathes of the Americas, and trading posts from Africa to the Philippines, which he'd named after himself. For 42 years, he's been the most meticulous ruler in Christendom. Diplomats joke that if death came for Philip, it would have to wait in his antechamber while he finished his paperwork. This is a man so obsessed with order that courtiers say he can't tolerate a single thread out of place in his bedroom. He personally reviews every document that crosses his desk, annotating margins with his spidery handwriting, sometimes adding corrections to grammar in letters from his own ambassadors. One visitor to his study at the Escorial Palace describes finding the king surrounded by exactly arranged stacks of papers, each pile measured to be precisely the same height. By 1598, Philip is 71 years old, and his body has become a catalogue of aristocratic ailments. Gout has tortured him for 3 decades, that distinctly royal disease that comes from too much rich food and wine, crystallizing uric acid in the joints until they swell like overripe fruit. His fingers are so deformed that he's developed a special way of holding a pen, gripping it between his palm and thumb since his other fingers won't close properly. But gout is almost fashionable among European nobility. What Philip doesn't know, what no one in 1598 could know, is that his body harbours something far worse. On a sweltering July morning in 1598, Philip makes a decision that will seal his fate. Against the urgent advice of his physicians, he orders his servants to prepare for the journey from Madrid to El Escorial, his massive granite palace monastery 30 miles northwest of the capital. The Escorial isn't just any palace. Philip has spent 21 years building this geometric marvel, a perfect rectangle of grey stone rising from the Castilian plain, part palace, part monastery, part mausoleum. Locals call it the 8th wonder of the world. Foreign visitors are less kind. The French ambassador writes that it looks like a gridiron made of granite, referring to its distinctive layout that supposedly honours St. Lawrence, who was martyred by being roasted alive on a metal grill. The king's doctors beg him to reconsider. Madrid's medical facilities are superior, they argue. The July heat will make travel dangerous for a man in his condition. But Philip is adamant. If he's going to die, and by now he suspects he might be, he wants to die at the Escorial, surrounded by his collection of 7,000 holy relics, and within sight of the tombs where his father, Emperor Charles V, already rests. The journey takes 2 days. Witnesses describe a ghastly procession. Philip, strapped into a specially constructed chair that keeps his gouty limbs immobile, wincing with every bump in the road. The carriers try to move smoothly, but 17th century Spanish roads are treacherous. Each jolt sends lightning through the king's inflamed joints. By the time they reach the Escorial on July 22nd, Philip is feverish. Still, he insists on being carried through his palace to inspect certain chambers, as if conducting a final review. He pauses longest at his private bedroom, a surprisingly modest space for the world's most powerful monarch, just 13 feet by 11 feet, with whitewashed walls and a simple bed. This is the bed he's chosen to die in, and unbeknownst to anyone yet, his death will take 52 days. For the first week at Escorial, Philip's condition follows a familiar pattern. The physicians identify it as tertian fever, likely malaria, which strikes every 3 days with clockwork precision. On fever days, Philip shivers under piles of blankets despite the July heat. On clear days, he rallies enough to hear Mass and dictate letters. But on the night of July 26th, something changes. Philip collapses into his bed after dinner, and this time he can't get up. The fever is different, hotter, meaner. His personal physician, Dr. Andres Zamudio de Alfaro, is summoned. Zamudio has served the royal family for 15 years, but what he finds that night makes him step back from the bed in alarm. The king's right knee has swollen to twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shining. When Zamudio gently presses the swelling, Philip screams, a sound that echoes through the palace corridors. Servants who've attended the king for decades have never heard him make such a noise. Over the next few days, the knee continues to swell. The skin turns from red to purple to a sickly yellow-green. Zamudio recognizes the signs. An abscess is forming deep in the muscle. In modern terms, we'd call it septic arthritis, likely triggered by Philip's compromised immune system and decades of gout damage. In 1598, Zamudio simply knows that pus is accumulating inside the joint, and if it's not drained, the poison will spread through the king's body. The decision to operate on the King of Spain is not taken lightly. 3 of Philip's physicians spend an entire night debating, while the king writhes in his bed. Finally, at dawn on August 2nd, they agree. The abscess must be lanced. The surgery takes place in Philip's modest bedroom with its view of the altar. The king is held down by 4 strong servants, while the court surgeon, Maestro Juan, heats his blade in a candle flame. There's no anesthesia beyond a leather strap for Philip to bite. When the blade pierces the swollen knee, the result is immediate and horrifying. According to Antonio Cervera de la Torre, Philip's chaplain, who would later write the official account, the mass, which filled the entire muscle, leaked out. The smell, a mixture of rotting tissue and infection, is so overwhelming that one of the attending physicians has to leave the room to vomit. But here's the truly nightmarish detail. The drainage doesn't stop. The wound refuses to heal. Instead, it becomes a constantly weeping fistula. Servants count how often they must change the bandages, 40 times in a single day. The pus flows so continuously that they place brass basins under the king's knee to catch the discharge. Philip, the man who couldn't tolerate a single thread out of place, must now lie in bed while corruption literally pours from his body. From August 2nd onward, Philip II never leaves his bed again, not once. The infection has triggered a cascade of system failures. His other joints, already damaged by gout, become so inflamed that even the weight of a silk sheet is unbearable. When servants try to move him just enough to change the bedding, Philip's screams can be heard in the chapel, where monks are singing vespers, so they stop trying to move him. Think about that for a moment. The King of Spain, master of the world's largest empire, cannot be shifted even an inch in his bed. He must perform all bodily functions exactly where he lies. In an age before modern nursing care, before specialised medical beds, before even basic hygiene understanding, Philip II must defecate and urinate in the same spot where he sleeps, eats, and conducts state business. His secretary Cristobal de Mora writes letters describing the king's determination to continue governing despite his condition. Secretaries read documents aloud while standing as far from the bed as possible, trying to escape the increasingly powerful stench. Philip listens, his mind still sharp, and dictates responses between waves of pain. But the human body has limits, and Philip's is crossing them one by one. By the 3rd week of August, something new and terrible is happening to the king's body. The constant moisture from urine and feces, combined with the inability to move, has created perfect conditions for pressure sores. The skin on Philip's lower back begins to break down. Modern medicine would call these stage 4 pressure ulcers, the kind where tissue death extends down to the bone. In 1598, court observers use simpler language. The king's back is rotting. The smell in the royal chamber becomes indescribable. It's not just infection now, but active necrosis, dying flesh. The sweet, cloying odour of decay mixes with the sharper scent of pus and the acrid smell of waste. Servants burn aromatic herbs constantly. They place pomanders filled with cloves and cinnamon around the room. Nothing helps. One young page, new to royal service, faints upon entering the chamber for the first time. He's carried out and never returns to duty. Meanwhile, Philip's knee continues to deteriorate. The surgeon's daily reports to the Council of State become increasingly grim. The infection has eaten through muscle and is approaching bone. New abscesses appear on the king's hands and feet. Each one must be lanced, creating new sources of drainage, new sources of pain. Dr. Zamudio tries everything in the medical arsenal of 1598. When conventional treatments fail, he turns to remedies that seem bizarre even by the standards of the time. In late August, a learned physician named Dr. Mendoza arrives from Salamanca with a treatment inspired by the Old Testament. In the Book of Kings, the prophet Isaiah cures King Hezekiah's boils with a poultice of figs. If it worked for a biblical king, perhaps it will work for Philip. They mash fresh figs into a paste and apply it to the largest ulcer on Philip's knee. Amazingly, it seems to help. The wound begins to scab over. For 3 days, there's hope in the palace. Courtiers whisper that God has intervened. Then the scab breaks, and the discharge returns worse than before. The physicians move to more extreme measures. Someone remembers an ancient Roman treatment, human urine, heated and applied to wounds. The ammonia in urine, they reason, might cleanse the infection. The king's own urine is collected, warmed over a brazier, and soaked into linen strips that are pressed against his sores. Philip endures this without complaint. In fact, he endures everything with a stoicism that astonishes his attendants. He sees his suffering as divinely ordained, comparing himself to Job, the biblical figure God tested with boils from head to foot. But even Job's suffering had limits. Philip's seems endless. By early September, Philip II is unrecognisable. The robust monarch, who once stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, above average for his era, has shrunk to skeletal proportions. His weight has dropped so dramatically that his rings slide off his fingers. Yet paradoxically, his body is also swelling with dropsy, fluid retention that makes his abdomen distend like a pregnant woman's. One courtier, writing to a friend in Venice, describes the king as no longer dying like a monarch. He is decomposing like livestock. The ulcers have spread. They cover his lower back, his thighs, his hands and feet. Some have eaten so deep that bone is visible. The discharge from these wounds has taken on new colours: green, black, yellow, each indicating different types of infection and decay. Modern medical analysis suggests Philip was suffering from multiple conditions simultaneously: septicemia from the infected wounds, kidney failure from decades of gout, possible bone cancer, and general organ failure. His body was essentially shutting down system by system. But here's what makes Philip's case extraordinary. He's still conscious, still alert, still trying to rule Spain. On September 8th, just 5 days before his death, Philip signs official documents arranging his daughter Isabella's marriage to Archduke Albert of Austria. His signature is barely legible, just a shaky scrawl, but it's legally binding. The king, who once prided himself on his perfect penmanship, forces his swollen, rotting fingers to grip a quill one last time for his beloved daughter. Throughout this ordeal, Philip has been sustained by the unique feature of his bedroom at the Escorial. Remember that detail from the beginning? How he positioned his bed to see the altar? This wasn't coincidence. Philip had designed his private apartment so that when lying in bed, he could look through a small window directly into the church. Every morning at dawn, he watches the priests celebrate Mass. The golden gleam of the chalice, the rising incense, the rhythmic Latin chants, all visible from his deathbed. It's a remarkable piece of architectural planning. Philip has essentially embedded himself within the sacred space of the church, while remaining in his private chamber. He can participate in the divine offices without moving, without even speaking. The walls around his bed are covered with religious paintings and crucifixes. At the foot of his bed sits a silver reliquary containing what the church claims is a rib bone from St. Lawrence himself. Philip's eyes, when they're not closed in pain, move between these sacred objects in a kind of visual pilgrimage. His confessor, Fray Diego de Yepes, later writes that the king would stare at one particular crucifix for hours, the same ivory crucifix his father, Emperor Charles V, had held while dying 40 years earlier. Something extraordinary happens on September 11th. After weeks of unbearable agony, Philip's pain suddenly stops. The physicians are baffled. The infections haven't healed. If anything, they look worse. The smell hasn't improved. But Philip, for the first time in 7 weeks, isn't moaning. He's alert, clear-eyed, even cheerful. He asks for his children to be brought to him. When his son, the future Philip III, enters the chamber, the dying king manages to smile. He gives instructions about the governance of Spain, the management of the empire, the payment of certain debts. His mind is crystal clear, his voice stronger than it's been in weeks. The court witnesses are convinced they're seeing a miracle. God has granted the king a reprieve to set his affairs in order. Some dare to hope for recovery. But Dr. Zamudio recognises what's really happening. He's seen it before in dying patients, the final rally before death. The body, having fought for so long, suddenly stops fighting. The nervous system, overwhelmed by weeks of pain signals, simply shuts down those pathways. It's not healing, it's surrender. Philip seems to understand this too. He uses his newfound clarity not to celebrate, but to prepare. On the morning of September 12th, Philip requests the last sacraments. The Archbishop of Toledo himself comes to deliver them, but there's a problem. Philip can't be moved to receive communion properly. The solution they devise is both practical and poignant. They'll bring the altar to him. A temporary altar is constructed in the royal bedchamber. The same cloth that covers the high altar in the basilica is brought to cover this makeshift sacred space. The golden vessels, the consecrated host, the ceremonial candles, all transported to the room where the smell of death hangs so thick that the Archbishop must pause several times to compose himself. Philip receives communion with tears streaming down his face. Not tears of pain, he's beyond that now, but tears of what witnesses describe as profound spiritual emotion. That afternoon, his daughter Isabella tries one last desperate attempt to rouse her father from what seems like a final slide into unconsciousness. She screams that someone is disturbing his precious relics, hoping the shock will bring him back. Philip's eyes flutter open briefly, focusing on her face, but he says nothing. As darkness falls on September 12th, everyone knows the end is near. The death watch begins at midnight. Philip's family, his closest advisors, and several high-ranking churchmen gather around the bed. Candles are lit, not for light, but for their symbolic meaning. In Catholic tradition, candles represent the soul's journey from earthly darkness to divine light. At 3 a.m, Philip stirs. With sudden clarity, he asks for 2 specific items: the crucifix his father died holding, and a blessed candle from the shrine of Our Lady of Montserrat. Fray Fernando de Toledo brings the crucifix, carved from ivory, about 12 inches long, Christ's face rendered in exquisite detail. Philip's swollen fingers can barely close around it, but he manages to bring it to his lips. He kisses it once, twice, 3 times. The Montserrat candle is thick and white, made from pure beeswax. They place it in his right hand. The contrast is stark, the pure white wax against fingers blackened by infection and decay. Through the open doorway to the chapel, the sound of monks beginning the dawn mass drifts into the chamber. They're singing the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, a hymn about the final judgment. The Latin words echo off the stone walls: Dies Irae, Dies Illa, solvet saeculum in favilla. Day of Wrath. That day will dissolve the world in ashes. Philip's lips move silently, following the familiar words. As the first rays of sunlight break over the Guadarrama mountains and stream through the window of Philip's chamber, illuminating the altar he's watched for 8 weeks, the King of Spain takes his final breath. The exact time is recorded by 3 different witnesses: 5 o'clock in the morning, September 13th, 1598. It's the feast of St. John Chrysostom, known for his eloquent sermons about suffering and redemption. The coincidence is not lost on the faithful. Philip's son drops to his knees beside the bed. Isabella lets out a single sob, "Padre," before covering her face. The Archbishop begins the prayers for the dead in Latin, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. But here's the detail that stays with everyone who was present. In death, Philip's face transforms. The grimace of pain that has been fixed there for 2 months softens. His features, despite the ravages of disease, appear peaceful. Some swear he's almost smiling. The servants face an impossible task. The king's body must be prepared for burial, but it's in a state of advanced decay. The room must be cleared, but the smell is so overpowering that workers can only stay for minutes at a time. They discover that under his nightshirt, Philip has been wearing a hair shirt, a garment of rough cloth designed to irritate the skin as a form of religious penance. He's been adding to his own suffering deliberately, seeing it as a way to share in Christ's passion. The embalmers work quickly, using massive amounts of aromatic spices to mask the smell. Even so, when the body is placed in the chapel for the funeral service that evening, incense must be burned continuously. Philip is buried that same night in the royal crypt of the Escorial, exactly where he planned to be buried when he designed the building decades earlier. The man who orchestrated every detail of his life had orchestrated his death and burial too. News of Philip's death spreads across Europe with remarkable speed for 1598. Within 2 weeks, London knows. Within a month, the Pope in Rome is saying special masses for Philip's soul. But it's the manner of his death that captures imaginations. The image of the world's most powerful monarch rotting alive becomes instant propaganda. Protestant pamphleteers in England and the Netherlands portray it as divine judgment for the Spanish Inquisition. Catholic writers frame it as a holy martyrdom, comparing Philip to St. Lawrence on his gridiron. The Spanish court physician, Andrés Zamudio de Alfaro, writes a medical account that becomes one of the earliest detailed clinical descriptions of septicemia and multiple organ failure. Though he doesn't use those terms, his notes on the progression of Philip's wounds will be studied by physicians for the next century. Philip II's death marked more than the end of a king. It marked the beginning of the end of Spanish dominance. Within a generation, Spain would lose its position as Europe's superpower. The empire that Philip held together through sheer will and meticulous administration would start its long, slow fragmentation under weaker successors. But perhaps the most striking aspect of Philip's death is what it reveals about power itself. Here was a man who commanded fleets, who could order the execution of thousands, who controlled wealth beyond imagination. Yet in his final weeks, he couldn't command his own servants to move him an inch without screaming in agony. All his power couldn't purchase him the simple dignity of dying clean. The contrast between Philip's earthly might and his physical helplessness became a powerful memento mori for an entire generation of European rulers. When Louis XIV of France was dying a century later, he reportedly said, "I thought dying would be harder," a direct reference to the legendary suffering of Philip II. Over 4 centuries, Philip's death has been embellished, mythologized, and sometimes sanitized. Victorian historians added details about maggots and vermin that don't appear in contemporary accounts. Romantic painters depicted beautiful deathbed scenes that ignore the horrific medical reality. But the core truth remains stark. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful man of his age, died over 52 days of unimaginable suffering. His death was neither quick nor dignified. It was a slow dissolution of flesh that tested the very limits of human endurance and faith. Yet through it all, he never stopped being king. Even as his body betrayed him in the most humiliating ways possible, his mind remained focused on his duty. That, perhaps, is the most remarkable aspect of this entire grim story. Not the suffering itself, but the determination to remain Philip II, by the grace of God, King of Spain, Portugal, Naples, Sicily, and the Indies, right up until that final breath at dawn. The Escorial still stands today, its grey granite walls unchanged since Philip's time. Visitors can walk through his modest bedroom, see the bed where he died, peer through the same window at the altar he watched for 8 weeks. The room has been cleaned, of course. The smell is long gone. But something of that final agony seems to linger in the austere space, a reminder that death comes for emperors and beggars alike, and sometimes it comes slowly. If this story of royal suffering fascinated you, watch the bizarre death of Henry VIII next. Another tale of how absolute power couldn't protect against the absolute certainty of mortality.